and I will be passing it over to, this will be recorded. I'm going to pass it over to Marlene in a moment. You're all here to hear how things are going. The USDA triennial assessment is a required process that is done every 3 years. So the last time and the first time Connecticut required this to be done was 2022. And then most districts, I think we're at 99.9, completed the triennial assessment in 2025. And I know that there has been, thank you all for providing the information to myself and to Marlene and her team, that we can ensure that the federal requirements of completing the assessment and getting it posted, available to the public, is ensured. So again, this is a critical process to ensure that we are not just creating policies, that these health and wellness policies are being implemented, and that students are benefiting from that. So I am going to pass it over now to Marlene Schwartz, UConn Red Center for Food Policy and Health. The director.
Yes, thank you, Vanilla.
Okay.
So just confirming you can hear me and see my slides, right?
I can hear you and see your slides, and I will pop off
Perfect.
mute and let you know if there's any issues.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, hi, everyone. I am very excited to be here. I know that it has been a long process getting these triennial assessments done this past year, and I'm excited to show you where we are as a state and some ideas of some things we can do to help us all move forward. So for those of you who haven't been living in the world of school wellness policies for the last 20 years, like I have, I wanted to just spend a little bit of time explaining why we're doing this in the first place. There is a pretty long history to school wellness policies and a pretty rich database of why it's important. So this became a federal requirement way back in July of 2006. It came out of some legislation that passed in 2004, and it was really a response to concerns about childhood obesity and child nutrition, and that's why it came through the USDA. And the requirement was essentially that districts needed to take on the responsibility of looking at their own policies and practices when it came to nutrition and physical activity, and put something down on paper and go through the process of really working with a committee, not just having the Board of Education do it all by themselves, but to really have a committee that included all of the relevant parties so that they could figure out what would be best for their district. So these were the original elements that were required for school wellness policies. And we ended up with a lot of documents that looked kind of like this. Essentially, districts would write a policy that followed the guidelines of what was required. And that very first year, we were part of a 4-state project of gathering all of the policies in the state and evaluating them and seeing what they looked like. And I don't know if any of you were around way back then, but we actually, the Red Center and the Department of Education sent out reports that looked like this, that essentially showed districts how they were doing in terms of the strength and comprehensiveness of their policies across the different domains. This was the original WellSat. And it was, I thought, a really important way to demonstrate to school districts that the Department of Education was paying attention and was really interested in understanding the policies going on around the state. So the data began to accumulate in the field in terms of the importance of the policies, because I think sometimes people question if it really matters. Does it really make a difference? And the answer is yes. Yes, it does. So there have been a number of studies here. I've just highlighted a few of them that really document that when you have policies about, the sort of types of beverages and foods that are sold outside of the school meal program, that makes a difference. If you have policies about promoting fruits and vegetables, that makes a difference. Physical activity and physical education policies lead to kids getting more physical activity and physical education. And there have even been studies showing an effect on body mass index and weight-related outcomes, which was really the kind of original impetus for this. But the last study that I want to show you was actually one we did right here in Connecticut with that first set of policies that we collected. And some of you may know Susan Fiore. She was the person I was working with at that time. And essentially what we did is we collected the policies from all, at that point, 151 districts. And we, before this went into effect, we had done a survey of principals where we asked them what sorts of practices were in place in their school building. We then collected those policies and scored them using the WellSat. We then did another series of surveys of principals a year later to see what had changed. And we really found two important things. One is that the process of writing those policies as a state led to a sort of strong improvement in the practices that they were designed to address. But secondly, even when you looked across districts, there was a significant relationship between having a stronger policy, a more comprehensive policy, and more success in implementing those practices at the school level. So I say all of this just so that everybody knows that there really is evidence that this makes a difference. And I'm confident that this next go round, it's going to make even more of a difference because we have so much more information about exactly what's happening across the state from the sort of newly designed WellSat. So the next big sort of federal movement was the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. Back in 2016, they released a bunch of new rules of things that needed to be included in these policies. So these included, I think, some pretty important things. One is there needs to be an individual in every school to oversee compliance with the practices. Another is that districts need to look at evidence-based strategies and techniques. At that point, Smart Snacks came out. That was part of the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. So that needed to be included in the policies. And interestingly, it's not just about what you serve, but it's also about the marketing of food in school buildings. So any logos or signs or sort of branded items in the school building had to be limited to Smart Snacks and not other brands of food. And then finally, there's one that I feel like tripped a lot of people up, which is essentially there needed to be something in the policy about the snacks that were distributed during the school day, which is basically classroom parties. And the idea here is that when you're not selling it, but you're distributing it as a party or something like that, it's not required by law to meet Smart Snacks, but you do need to have a policy as a district as to what the regulations are for those foods. And again, this was kind of a way to require districts to really think about it and put something down in writing. Another change was making sure that that committee that had created the policy and was evaluating the policy really wasn't just the school food authority all by themselves, but included parents and students, other health professionals, PE teachers, board members, administrators, and even members of the general public if they wanted to join. So again, it was really trying to make this more comprehensive and thinking about the whole child and the whole child's physical health and how all of these professionals in the school district are important to include. And then finally, the triennial assessment that had never been a requirement before, but it began to be one with this final rule. And essentially, it was to make sure that these weren't just policies that got written, put on a shelf, and then nobody paid any attention to them again. So it requires every 3 years for schools to look at if they are in compliance with their own policy. They need to compare their policy to a model policy, and they need to really evaluate how much progress they're making in attaining the goals of that policy. So it's pretty prescriptive. And as Fionnuala just mentioned, the original one was actually due in 2020, which for obvious reasons got pushed out to 2022. So that was the first go round of this initiative. And then 3 years later was, of course, last June 30th in 2025. And the Department of Education and the Red Center have been working together to really try to support districts in meeting this requirement. And the tool that you all are probably familiar with by now, the WellSat, we had updated it in 2022 to meet all of the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act requirements, and had developed this WellSat I, which was designed to look at the practices instead of just the written word on the policy document. We then updated that again in 2025 based on feedback from many of you about what would make it work better for you. And we sort of reorganized some of the scales, pulled out the federal items so they were in their own scale, and tried to just make it much easier to talk about both what's in the policy and what your practices are in a way that is sort of parallel and makes sense. So to kind of break down the process that was required, we kind of broke it into 4 different steps, and each one of these was something you could do using the WellSat website. So the first part was assessing your policy, and that gave you each item that was required to be in the policy for the federal requirements, and then all the best practices were in the subsequent scales. And you could read the item and then look at your own policy and figure out where you scored. And the scoring mechanism was a 0, 1, or 2 scale. And basically, if you don't mention it at all, it's a 0. If you mention it, but in a sort of vague or incomplete way, it's a 1, like saying that you aspire, or you will try to do something, or you may do something. And then if you mention the policy in a very clear, concrete way using strong language like this will or shall happen, then you get a 2. Then on the other side, on the practice side, there was a series of essentially the same questions, but instead of being phrased about being in your policy, they were phrased about, is this happening in your schools? And here you would go through, read each item, and then this really required multiple committee members to come together, because the school food service director doesn't necessarily know exactly what's happening in classrooms or what's happening with PE. So this really, I feel like, required a group of people to come together, and hopefully that's what you all experienced in terms of identifying the practices within the school district. And it was also coded in this same 0, 1, 2 manner, but instead of what was written on the piece of paper, it was about what's happening in your schools. So if a particular practice is not happening at all, it's a 0. If it's happening some, like in some places or sometimes, but not consistently and not everywhere, then it was a 1. And if it's a practice that's really consistently taking place across the school, and the folks filling this out were confident that that was the case, then the score would be a 2. So this was a lot of information. We suddenly had these like 0, 1, and 2 for 67 items, and it was a ton of data. And so the challenge was, how do we pull this together to really give us useful information about where we want to go? And so after, quite a bit of sort of racking our brains, we came up with this sort of 4-bucket system, is how we describe it. And it's kind of this 2x2 table where, across the top, it ranges from strong policies to weak policies, and across the side, it ranges from strong practices to weak practices. And so we color coded these to make it a little bit easier to keep track of. And so the green quadrant is really all those items where you have strong policies and aligned practices. So this is the aspiration, right? This is where we all want to be. We want to have strong language in our policy, and we want to be sure that the things that are in our policy are being implemented across our school district. The yellow is where you are doing the activity, but it's not in your policy. And interestingly, across the research in this field, this is often where a lot of the action is, that school districts are often doing a lot of things, and school buildings are engaging in a lot of practices that are best practices, but it isn't always written down on the paper. And so the guidance in this quadrant is update your policies, especially if we're talking about one of the federally required practices, so that it's in there and it's sort of guaranteed for the future that everybody in the district knows that this is indeed our policy and this is how we do things. The blue, which I feel like is what everyone worries about, like in talking to schools, this is always the fear, right? That you'll have something in your policy and it's not getting implemented fully. So we do see some people, some districts that have some items in this blue, although I will say it does tend to be less common because I think the very strong aversion to being in a situation where you have a written policy that's not being implemented. But we do see it some, and I'm going to talk some about where we saw that in Connecticut. But essentially, this is where you have it in your policy, but you're just not implementing it. And so the guidance in that case is to come up with an implementation plan. And then finally, the sort of bottom right corner, the reddish color, is opportunities for growth. So these are the items that really are just not being addressed at all. They're not in the policy. They're not happening in the school. Again, as long as they're not federally required, that's fine. But we kept a lot of items in here as best practices because we want people to sort of have that opportunity to understand what has been shown in the research to be a best practice and to sort of give some thought to whether or not it's happening in their district. And hopefully in the process of doing this, perhaps identifying some things to work on. Okay, so back to the WellSat website, you got your scores, they were sorted into these categories, and then you had a chance to write a little narrative about each one of those buckets. So the website is set up to hopefully make it easier for you to do that by filling in the box. And then at the end, when you finish all of that, you are able to create a PDF. And that document, is sort of nicely formatted and is something that you can then post on your district website and make available for the public, which is the final sort of step of the triennial assessment, as well as having it available for your next administrative review. So that was the process that everybody has gone through. And as I mentioned, we had reorganized the WellSat into these 6 areas based on user feedback. So I'm going to go through and sort of present the findings in the same basic way as you see here, but also broken into a little bit smaller categories just for the purposes of our discussion. Okay. Good news, and I really think everyone should feel super great about this. We saw a statistically significant improvement from 2022 to 2025 in both the strength of the policies and the overall strength of the practices. So I think everybody should feel great about that. There's a few interesting things about this. This actual number is the average. And it goes from 0 to 2 because it's basically the average across all of those scores between 0 to 2 for the policy strength in 2022. So this is sort of showing, overall how strong your policies were, and then overall the level of implementation of the practices. And so you can see both categories got better. In addition, it's kind of interesting too to see that practices seem to be ahead of policies. And I think that has to do with that phenomenon of concern about putting things down on paper. But we're getting there. There's definitely more on paper now than there was in 2022. And you can see that everything is really moving in the right direction. Okay, more good news is the federally required items. So again, everything that's green is essentially the percentage of districts that reported that they had this in their policy and it was being fully implemented in their school. And you can see that the vast majority are doing it. So the green is where it's both the practice and the policy, and the yellow is the practice is happening, but they need to update their policies. So that is hopefully not too difficult of a fix. If you were in this yellow part of the bar, you have heard from us recently, either from me or someone on my team, because we've been following up with districts that reported that they didn't have these particular items explicitly stated in their policy. So my hope is that by next time, that yellow will have really shrunk down and the green will take up practically the entire bar. Because you can see it's really very few districts that have it in their policy and aren't doing it. That's the blue. or who don't have it in their policy and don't do it, which, as you can see, is pretty tiny. It's just the red. So so the federal requirements, I feel like we're in good shape, and we will be in even better shape, I'm guessing, by the end of the year.
Can I interject just for 1 second?
Sure.
Just so everybody, yes. So the federal requirements, they're obviously federal requirements. The expectation when these were completed in 2022 was it was a self-assessment, and that would be identified and then added in over the course of the next 3 years. It was with the 2025 assessment, we realized that there were many districts that still had that missing. So in coordination with Marlene and her team, we are trying to hit that on many levels. So also, some of you might have it come up during an administrative review. And really the goal is to get everything done before school year 2026-27. So by the time this is done in 2028, all of our sponsors will have that federally required language in there for their wellness policy. So we would see 100%. Just want to be clear with that as the state agency and what the expectations are.
Sure. Thanks, Finola. Okay, so here are additional federally required items that didn't perform quite as well. And you can tell because the blue bars are where something was in the policy but wasn't being implemented. And then the yellow is where it's being implemented, but it's not in the policy. And I just want to highlight a few of these. One thing that is super important, and I feel like we can work on this year in terms of providing technical assistance and strategizing with all of you, is making sure that there is an administrator who is responsible for compliance. And that is super important and is written in a lot of the policies, but in over a third is actually not happening. So that's sort of the first thing I want to flag as something very specific that I think we can work on in terms of communicating with superintendents and principals to help them understand that it is actually their responsibility to make sure that these policies are being implemented at the district and school building level. Another thing that I think will absolutely look better next time is that the practices reflect having updated things based on the triennial assessment. So, there had only been one before this one. Some districts said they had indeed made changes since the last triennial assessment. But as Finola just indicated, we have followed up with many of you, and our hope is that we really will see quite a lot of change based on the current triennial assessment. So hopefully this will be much more green next time. Another thing that's a pretty easy fix, but was missing from a lot of policies was specifically referencing the smart snacks during the school day. That essentially we were looking for like a link or sort of a document, like a link to a document or a link to the USDA website, just making it super easy that anybody who is selling food, if it's not one of you, not one of the food service folks, but someone who's doing a fundraiser or who is selling food as part of a school store or something like that, that they all understand what the Smart Stack standards are. So just adding that to the policy will take care of that big yellow part, and combine that with the administrative oversight. I'm hoping that will make the job of the school food service administrators a lot easier because people will know what they're supposed to be doing. Class parties. Oh my goodness. I was reflecting that the very first talk I gave in Connecticut, I think it was at the Water's Edge, and it was like the early 2000s. And the name of my talk was, "But how do I tell parents not to bring cupcakes?" Because this issue just is the one that is one of the stickiest, difficult ones to deal with. There are parents who have very strong feelings in favor of class parties and against class parties that include, food. And it's one of the things I think that's hard for districts to really grapple with. But the reality is, having a written written policy is going to make everybody's job easier, because then you're not sort of stuck between parents arguing with you. So this is the one where I feel like we've gotten the most phone calls, because this is a federal requirement. We followed up with districts that didn't have anything written, and we have gotten calls from principals like, how am I supposed to do this? So I think this is something where we can continue to really try to provide some technical assistance, and maybe even put together some panels where administrators that have successfully done this can share how they did it and what kind of messaging they used with their families that worked. Okay, so cafeteria best practices. We've sort of pulled these together to look at with, sort of the different settings and depending on sort of who's in charge of them. So again, making sure that those smart snack standards are clear in the policy is something that's really going to, I think, make it easier to ensure that there aren't foods being sold that are in violation of that particular federal regulation. And then this one, which is one of the areas where we're not, like we sort of see a kind of decent amount of red there, is local food procurement. And I'm completely confident that this is going to look better next time because of the Connecticut Fresh Ed initiative and all of the farm to school work and the Compass. And there's just so much investment and really passion, I feel like, in Connecticut right now for promoting more local produce, that I look forward to seeing how this one looks next time. Okay, next up is nutrition education. And I would say that one of the areas that is doing reasonably well, like sort of a little more than half say that it's in their policy and they're practicing it, is nutrition education. But I feel like we can do more in terms of making it being interactive, really sort of making sure that it has a lot of hands-on activities and is participatory. And so I think thinking about training in terms of interactive nutrition education across the state would be something to consider. Another element of nutrition education that really makes it sort of come alive for students is integrating it across different subjects. So the idea here is not just having nutrition education kind of living by itself in the curriculum in one very specific, set of lesson plans, but rather to think about how it can be built into lots of other subjects, science and math and all sorts of things. And there are a lot of creative ideas out there of how to do that. And I think that's something that we could look to having some technical assistance in the state. And then the last two, which again, back to the farm to school, is making sure that nutrition education includes farm to school content. So really helping students learn where their food is grown, learning about agriculture, particularly our agriculture here in Connecticut. So as you can see, there's a lot of room for improvement there. And linking it to the school food environment. So finding ways for the cafeteria and the classroom to connect and really try to, expose students to both the information, but then also the foods where they can, think about what they've learned in terms of nutrition education. So I think there's a lot of exciting potential for those. Next up is physical education. And here, again, you can see there's, pretty good compliance in terms of policies and practices with having a written curriculum, having it promote an active lifestyle, making sure our PE teachers are qualified. And another thing, though, is that this middle part, which has to do with ensuring that PE teachers are getting professional development specific to them for physical education, is something that's happening, but isn't necessarily in the policy. So that's a good thing to add. And then this issue of exemptions and substitutions. So these are ways in which students sort of are able to not take PE. So sometimes it's an exemption because they have some other activity that they're doing, and districts will have policies about when you're allowed to do that. And substitutions is sometimes when a student is, playing a sport or something like that, and makes an argument that that should substitute for PE. The reality is that doesn't happen a lot in Connecticut if you look at the green and the yellow together, but it would be really great to get that all in writing so that when those situations come up, it's clear that this is the district policy and we want all of our students to have PE. And then finally, this is the one area, even in the national research, that is most likely to be a policy that's not implemented. So remember, I said that blue category is what everybody wants to avoid, having a written policy that's actually not getting done. And for every study I do, it always shows up as PE time per week. And I think it's because the policies tend to say what they really are aspiring to do. And the reality is they are not doing it. And I think there are a lot of challenges to increasing the number of minutes of PE at every grade level, elementary, middle, and high. But there are districts that have figured out how to do it, and it would be great to learn from them and to try to find ways to give the districts that are in that blue bucket the ability to really fully implement the policies that they clearly care about because they've written them down. Okay, physical activity. So we're doing great with recess, probably helped by the fact that we also have a state law. So across the board, everything looks great in terms of students, the younger students getting recess. It's mostly in the policy. It can be added to the ones that it's not in. But a couple of areas that I did want to highlight where we could see changes and we can sort of think about what to prioritize. One is having the family and the community have opportunity for physical activity on school grounds. And there are these documents called shared use agreements, which is sort of a legal way to ensure that, it's safe for people to use the school grounds. The school is not going to be, suddenly like open to being liable if there's an injury or something like that. So there's technical ways to handle this, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement in terms of families and community members being able to use the, sort of the building and the grounds of schools to increase their physical activity as well. And then this last one, safe routes to school. This is definitely something nationally. There was a lot of excitement about, how do we get back to kids walking to school, biking to school? It's very aspirational. I think people really want it to happen. I think in reality, it's super challenging. And I think that's what we're seeing here. So, I mean, it'd be interesting conversation to think about if there are districts that really want to work on this. But my experience is this has been a tough one because it's just very hard to find safe ways for students to get from home all the way to school without buses and cars. So it's an item on the WellSat because it's considered a best practice, but it's definitely one of the ones that I feel like has a lot of challenges associated with it. So rewards and punishments, I wanted to put these all together on one slide because I feel like in terms of a theme, they do kind of all go together. And I think they affect the school climate, which is something that, the state really cares about, particularly right now as districts are thinking about their school climate and assessing their school climate. And it has to do with sort of rewards and punishment and how food or physical activity gets involved with that. So, the good news is most districts are not using physical activity as punishment. So thank goodness. I was very happy to see this. It's a tiny fraction that reported that it might happen sometimes. So we need to make sure for that yellow group that gets written into their policy. So it's very clear that you cannot use physical activity as a punishment for students. But another one, though, that is also very important, but tends to be a little more common is withholding physical activity as a punishment. I mean, I remember when my children were in elementary school, them coming home and saying, oh, we had to sit inside the classroom during recess because we were being too noisy and they took away our recess as a punishment. Now, I happen to have known that that was against the policy in our school district. And I talked to the principal and we kind of figured out it was a communication problem with all of of the staff. But that is one where it's really important not to withhold physical activity as punishment. And I think there's some work that needs to be done to make sure that is not happening anywhere. The next one, which has to do with school meals, is about students who have unpaid meal balances. And this is an issue that also has gotten quite a bit of national attention, and there are a bunch of states that have laws about this. But essentially, the USDA doesn't require you to provide the full, like, hot reimbursable school meal to students with unpaid meal balances. The option of providing an alternate meal is legal. However, it's definitely not a best practice. And so this is something that, again, I don't think is happening a lot in Connecticut, because between the green and the yellow, it's pretty much everybody. But I think it would be worth a conversation to really think about that and sort of that whole issue, which I know is a real burden, unpaid meal balances, but thinking
Marlene.
about how to handle that. Yep.
Yep, so Connecticut has a law
Oh,
that
we
came
do?
out, yeah, that came out 2 years ago during COVID. So, our sponsors, every child is required to have a meal, regardless of their unpaid meal charges.
Okay.
So we have been working diligently issuing, I'll pop something in the chat just for any sponsors on here. We have a guidance, we have a manual, we have been assisting as we're conducting administrative reviews. We're reviewing everybody's charge policy to make sure they have not only the correct language in there, also internal procedures for training and communicating. If there, and there's, it even is so finite that, up to 30 unpaid meals, it has to be a referral to the homeless liaison to make sure, other things are in place. So there has been Connecticut legislation that has passed, and all students are required to get a meal regardless of negative charges in Connecticut.
No, thanks for telling me. I did not know that. So that's super helpful. So just as a follow-up, does it have to be like the regular reimbursable meal, like the hot meal, or can it be
Yeah,
like
no.
it does? Okay.
It absolutely cannot be
Great.
an emergency, as Jackie Shipke, Swiss cheese on rye or something that
Yeah.
they wouldn't. Has to be the normal. They can't be. There has to be no overt identification of a child that has a child. So every child would receive a meal. Yeah.
Okay, that is great to know. And so you can tell it's not many that are in the blue or the red on that line, but for those districts that are, it sounds like there's a lot of resources available to really try to make sure that that policy is being fully implemented. Okay, another sort of category is encouraging the use of physical activity as a reward. So this is kind of an idea that if you're going to prohibit food as a reward, which, as you can see, is the next one, is really helping people come up with ways of using physical activity as a reward instead, more time to play a game outside, things like that. So it is definitely happening in many districts, although it is missing from the policy in some districts, and there's a decent number of districts that aren't doing it. Prohibiting food as a reward is another one where it's actually in the written policies of more than half of the districts. But as you can see from that big blue bar, this is another one where the policy is not necessarily getting implemented fully. And so this, I think, requires a lot of communication with every school building, every teacher, really, every paraprofessional. I mean, everyone who really interacts with students in a school building. It can feel so natural to use food as a reward when you're working with children, and yet it really is not a best practice. And there are a variety of reasons to avoid having, food that different people happen to bring into the building handed out to kids. So this is one I think that could use some work. And then, as I mentioned before, snacks at parties, FR11, that fits in here as well. And so sort of tackling both of these at once and thinking about food that's provided to students during the school day in the school building, and making sure it's not being used to sort of reinforce behavior, and that the food that is provided, if it is meeting all the federal guidelines. Okay, So administration and training. So these are some of the items that really have to do with kind of the teachers and the adults getting what they need as well. So making sure that PE teachers are qualified for their job. That looks really, really good. Having an ongoing district wellness committee is another item that we're looking quite good across the state. Having the training, the professional development for the PE teachers, we kind of put in this bucket as well. And then looking for strategies to support employee wellness. So this is, kind of a different topic than the original school wellness policies were so focused on the students. But the idea here is to really think about the staff as well, and how can we promote staff wellness and provide resources for staff. So again, between the green and the yellow, you can see a lot is happening across the state. So it would be great to learn more about that to really help districts that haven't taken that on specifically. Another practice that has been shown in the research to make a real difference is having not just a district committee, but to have a school building committee. And certainly in, big districts, there's a sort of a long distance between something that's happening at the district level and then every single building across the district. So ideas on how to really have those building level committees and how to sort of best structure their time in terms of implementing their wellness policy, I think would be something worth spending some time on, because you can see there's quite a lot of districts that really aren't doing that at all. And then finally, staff, thinking about staff as role models for students. I mean, this is the tricky one because it is sort of easier said than done, but those districts that are doing it, and there certainly are some, to kind of learn what they're doing, how they're doing it, how they're sort of bringing that positive messaging into the building. So those were those last two. Okay, so I just have a few more slides. I want to kind of summarize based on my read of these assessments, where we could spend our time together over the next year or two, thinking about professional development and really supporting schools in all of these best practices. So number one, food sold and served outside of the meal program, making sure that those smart snack standards are linked to in your policy, and coming up with ideas of how to really distribute those standards to the whole community. So if you have basically anybody who is selling food in your school building, it should know what the smart snack standards and be able to find them and, be educated about them. Really helping the administration understand about smart snacks, and honestly, the consequences of competitive foods. I hear stories of food service directors who, sort of find out that some teacher has decided that Friday is pizza day and the students did a great job on some project. And so they're bringing in pizza and giving it to all the kids. And of course, those students are then not going to go eat the school lunch. And I really doubt that pizza meets all of the federal guidelines. So stuff like that happens. And so we need to really make sure that administrators understand the rules and understand really the consequences of when these foods are coming in during the meal times and competing with the school meal program. And as I mentioned, educating teachers about food as a reward in classroom parties. So I think that's like a whole sort of array of items that I feel like we can come up with some communication. It's not that we need to communicate the foods to the food service. We need to communicate with superintendents. We need to communicate with the principals. We need to communicate with the teachers. So it's really helping everybody else understand what the rules are. Physical activity, again, here is another communication challenge of ensuring that everybody understands the policies prohibiting the use of physical activity as either a punishment or restricting it as a punishment. And if possible, thinking of ways to allow the community to use the facilities of the school. So that's sort of a positive one that I think would be nice to work on. Administration, really making sure that whoever is the responsible administrator in the building knows that they are the administrator and has tools to implement the policy. So I feel like that one really goes hand in hand with the others. and establishing school level teams so that, again, all of the work doesn't fall onto the district committee, but rather you have people in every school building who are really keeping an eye on all of this. And then Farm to School, I'm super excited. There's so much happening in Connecticut with Farm to School that I am sure we're going to see great progress on this. And I just look forward to being part of that. And then nutrition education, thinking about ways to integrate the curriculum with the cafeteria with other subjects. So I feel like that's an area where there's probably a lot of material out there, but I'm not sure how accessible it's been for everybody who's doing nutrition education in the schools. So trying to think about how to reach out to the people in districts who are working on curriculum and have them think more about this. And then PE, as I mentioned, a lot of schools aspire to have more minutes of PE, but don't have them. So what would it take to increase the amount of PE, and how can we work with the PE professionals in the state to really support them in finding ways to increase the amount of physical activity kids are getting during the school day through PE. And the policies, again, here's a place where we have a lot of practices, but there's a lot of missing language from policies on the PE professional development and that exemption and substitution issue. So I'm going to open it up to other ideas and requests. But before I do that, I just wanted to make a quick plug for a professional training opportunity that we are doing. We, the Red Center, along with colleagues from the NEAG school at UConn, we call it the annual Connecticut Whisk Academy. Maybe some of you have come. Last year, we actually spent the whole time talking about triennial assessments and trying to really help people. This year, we are taking on a different topic. We are looking at the new policy about school climate and the requirements for school districts to have a plan to address school climate and how we can integrate that with wellness. Like, we're really on a mission to try to have fewer silos and sort of separate initiatives. And how can we really bring together all of the people in the district who are focused on student health and having them work together and really develop synergy as opposed to kind of each doing their own thing. So that's what we'll be talking about on May 20th. Everyone is invited. And this is my email address. In case you don't have it, you can always reach out to me. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people.
Thank you so much, Marlene. That was great data and kind of great to see that we are moving in the right direction, and certainly some simple tips and things to do as well. We actually were joined by a good number of people. I know that Sean is on, so he may take care of the chat if there's anything in the chat. Otherwise, if you had a question for Marlene, you can either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand and come off mute as well. Right, Sean? I think they can.
Yeah, that'd be great. Folks are happy to do that. We did have a question asking if they can have access to the slides of future.
John, you're coming in really, really light for me. I don't know if
you can't hear.
Sorry, that was a user error. We did have a request to share the slides, so we are going to make this recording available, and we'll. Sounds like we can share the slides.
Yeah, I'm happy to share the slides. If it's easier, just have the slides to show people that. I'm perfectly happy to do that.
Great. Yeah, there's no questions in the chat currently, but folks are welcome to put them in or come off mute.
Looks like Jill has a question.
Go ahead, Jill.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Marlene, that was great presentation. Thank you.
Sure.
So when you're talking about the curriculum for physical activity, that's one of our issues that we're having. Not issue, I really shouldn't say it's an issue. But I have been speaking with curriculum, my administrator on curriculum, and it's like in their minds, it's a huge ask because now you're adding time onto an entire school day. Basically, you're transitioning an entire school day to fit in that curriculum, that phys ed curriculum. And And we do have some gym teachers that are on our wellness committee that when that came up in our triennial assessment, kind of like, their eyes popped out of their head and it was, it was kind of shocking and I don't blame them. But since we do have solid recess in our district, can that recess and phys ed be part of all combined as a physical activity rather than only the gym physical activity? Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, no,
I'm
thanks for that question. So, the so there's sort of a couple ways to look at it. Yes, the time kids spend in gym and the time that they spend in recess, when you're thinking comprehensively, there's something called like the Comprehensive School Physical Activity Program, I think this PAP, is sort of thinking about the school day that way, like making sure there's opportunities for kids to be active even before or after school. And that is a holistic way of looking at it, and I think is worthwhile for the committee to do. I think, the gym teachers I know, the sort of PE professionals I know, they do feel really passionately about real PE because you're not just spending time being physically active, but you're really learning how to maintain physical activity for a lifetime and really develop those skills. And so I think they are always up against the administration in terms of, fighting over minutes, and the administrators have to make sure everything else is covered. So I think every school district struggles with this. I'm curious to kind of go back to the ones that reported that they were indeed meeting, pretty high number of minutes of physical education and find out how they're doing that. Because I think it, kind of comes down to the district just setting it as a priority. And, there's a lot of competing priorities. So it would have to be really, looking at what can be done that's feasible, and are there ways that other opportunities, like you're saying, can be made for students to be physically active that don't necessarily take away time for instruction, but rather incorporate physical activity into instruction.
Thank you.
Sure. I guess I'll just ask I was going to just ask a question. So, I kind of identified the things that stood out to me as I was going through our data, in terms of what kind of professional development or tools might be helpful to districts over the next year or two. Are there other things that, it sounds like this dealing with the PE minutes is one. Are there other things that would be helpful as you go back, to your committee with your findings? Stephanie.
How about some education for parents?
Uh-huh.
We right now in my district we are battling the battle of breakfast, and um I don't know, it doesn't really seem to matter what you explain about the regs, how you explain it. Compare, I'm in a bid co-op with 40 other districts. Looking at other district school menus, we're all pretty much serving the same thing, and it just seems that there is no good enough answer.
So parents are asking questions about the menu for breakfast?
Yeah, they're not every it's the request is always, healthier, healthier, healthier. And I say, well, tell me what healthier is that your child will eat and give me actual food products. I can't go on a Thurston's website and put healthier in the search bar and come up with meal choices.
Uh-huh.
So it's been like a year going now.
Interesting. So that's great. That's like a super concrete ask. Like, are there districts that have identified breakfast items that seem to have, that parents seem to interpret as being healthier? What are those? How much do they cost? Where do you get them? Do your kids eat them? Right? Would those be the
Right, that,
questions?
yeah, that, and then, explaining that, most of our breakfast is grab and go. Kids aren't sitting in the calf and eating.
Mhm.
We're breakfast compared to lunch. We're serving hundreds of kids in 10 minutes versus hundreds of kids stretched out over an hour and a half of lunch waves.
Mhm.
Those things, again, just really don't seem to factor into their mind on, where we have to meet our needs and still get done what we need to get done in the time frame, and which, limits what we can serve. And yeah, it's the
Mhm.
whole thing.
Great. No, that's super helpful. Thank you. Christine?
Yes. I recall seeing a resource. I don't know who provided it. It was 100 ways, and this is in reference to, again, parents and the community and getting additional buy-in and understanding for fundraising and school celebrations and classroom parties. 100 ways to celebrate without using food. That wasn't the name of it, but it was something like that. And other alternative, healthier ways to celebrate an event, school-wide or classroom. Resources like that we could then forward to PTOs, PTAs, open houses, etc. I think would really go a long way. We can try to explain. It's very difficult to take something away or prohibit something if you aren't offering other attractive options.
Yep. Yep. No, I agree with you 100%. And I have seen those lists, and I think Connecticut had one, but it might be I think it dates back pretty long. So
Mhm.
we
I just-
could look at updating that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just put in the chat. We have a whole how many pages? 6 pages of resources, and Action for Healthy Kids has that as well. Chris, it was, we pulled down ours because, as Marlene said, it was quite old. So over before my time, 18 years ago. So, but there's been updated versions through other organizations, associations. So I just popped in the chat the resource we have that has up-to-date different things. Yep, from the CDC, from USDA, different toolkits. And it also has what you talked about, and there's everything in there from nutrition education and promotion and physical activity and food on campus, rewards and fundraisers and things like that. I'll put a few more in the chat as well. And someone also asked about the Whisk Academy on May 20th. So I just took a snip of that and popped that in the chat. Marlene, and letting them know it looks like registration hasn't opened yet.
No,
But
not
when
yet.
you have it open, we usually run something in our Wednesday school lunch tray because, as Marlene said, it's open. Usually they come as a team, right? You have
Yes,
a
that's what
team
we
of
like
individuals.
best, is having a team. So having, people who are on the committee, for you guys, people who worked on the triennial assessment, to come as a team and think about how to bring everything back to your district. I just had another thought, though, about going back to the resources. I mean, there are a lot of resources out there, as Fanula said. What I would love would be, though, to have, because that we have the data now, we could contact the districts that report that they've figured it out, that they've found ways to do fundraising without food, that they've found ways to, to reward kids in the classroom in other ways, and kind of figure out what's happening right here in Connecticut, and maybe coming up with some resources that really emphasize that this isn't just a theoretical idea, but actually, the school district 10 miles away is doing this. And I feel like that sometimes can also make it feel more feasible when you actually know someone who's been able to do it.
That's great. And I think that you're hinting, that's what we're hoping to do over the next 3 years before the next, I guess, 2 years now. Triennial assessment is to really provide more resources. The second link I dropped in was actually 30 pages, and it has many more resources, very specific, alternate to food rewards, and things like that, celebrations. So that is a 30-page document, and that's specific to resources and wellness policies. And then I popped in a few others too. But You're right. Sometimes there's just so much out there, you don't know what to access also. But I think it's a great idea to lean on those that are doing it well and to share how they got there to help other districts or sponsors. So
Well, thanks.
great. We're coming, if we have another question, that's great, but we're coming on 3 o'clock. So is there something else in the chat? I didn't see a question.
Stacy just put in healthy breakfast ideas that they've used, which is
Love
great.
it. Yes, we've got the sharing already happening. Which is good. Marlene,
Awesome.
thank you so much
Sure.
for all of your work on this. It has been just such a pleasure to collaborate with the Department of Education and support our sponsors and to have such an amazing center and group right here in Connecticut that provides resources nationwide and really to be able to work with you. So we look forward to some further partnership to help our school districts and schools just do the best that they can and help overcome some challenges. And I think that is it. That is a wrap. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
And thank
and
you everyone to join.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining and thanks for all your work completing these assessments. I want to really make it work for you.
Good point. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.